I have a number of questions that I'll be asking, but this is really just a discussion. So if I ask a question and Governor, it's pointed toward you, Jonathan, if you want to chime in, feel free to do so. But the first thing I think we all want to hear about is the book, The Anxious Generation. Can you give us a synopsis and what was the motivation behind doing it?
Okay. Well, thank you, Donna. And it's a great pleasure to be here in Arkansas. As we'll get into, this is one of the states that's leading the charge to undo the crazy damage that we did to kids. And I'm just thrilled to be here with the governor, who was one of the first to act on this. So the book is about a mystery. The mystery is, why did teenagers in the United States suddenly get depressed and anxious beginning in 2012, 2013? The mental health stats were pretty stable from the late 90s all the way through 2010, 2011, no sign of a problem. And all of a sudden, the rates of anxiety and depression go shooting up. Why? Here are a couple of clues. It hits girls harder than boys. The girls' rates go up faster than everyone else, than boys. Here's another clue. It wasn't just us. It was the same in Canada, the UK, New Zealand, Australia, Scandinavia. What could possibly explain something all around the world that's devastating teen mental health, and especially girls' mental health? And I've been studying this for years, trying to understand what happened. And the answer that I came up with is what the book is. The book is an attempt to explain it. And at the heart of the book is an understanding of the importance of puberty, especially like all of childhood, but especially puberty is such an important transition time. And so the way to understand what happened to us is that in 2010, young people were known as millennials, and they went through puberty with a flip phone, no front-facing camera, no Instagram. Raise your hand if you were born between 1980 and 1995. Raise your hand high. Okay, so you're all millennials. And do you remember having a flip phone or something like that? And you'd call your friends, right? You'd text them, and then you could play Snake or something like that, right? There was like a game. There was some game. So you went through puberty with a little device that connected you to one friend at a time, for the most part, and you came out fine overall. But suppose you weren't born in 1990. Suppose you were born in the year 2000. What was your puberty like? You got your first smartphone probably when you were 10 or 11. It was probably an iPhone. You had Instagram and a front-facing camera. So by 2015, it was normal, especially for girls, to be on their phone most of the day. Half of American teens, by 2019, half of American teens were saying that they were online almost constantly. The phone's always in the hand. They might look at you briefly, but they're thinking about what's going on the phone. And when you take children and you take away their childhood and you give them 1,000,000 15-second videos as a substitute, it interferes with development. And that is the story that I tell in the book about why it is that teen mental health collapsed around the world, especially for girls, pretty much exactly around 2012, 2013.
Okay, and Governor, you gave this book to all of the Arkansas delegation legislators, and then I read you also shared this book with governors all over the country. So obviously this is something that means a lot to you. Why is that?
Well, I think there are a lot of reasons. First and foremost, I'm a parent. I have 3 kids. My husband, Brian, is here today, and we have a 7th grader, a 5th grader, and a 3rd grader. So we're living all of the challenges that you so eloquently laid out in your book every single day. One of the biggest fights we have at our house is whether or not our 7th grade daughter gets a smartphone and when she gets it and what kind of access our kids will have to technology. And so we're experiencing it as parents, but I'm also seeing the impact that it's having on our state, in our schools, in our healthcare. And we are watching some of the worst things that you can imagine just skyrocket, whether it's anxiety, depression, suicide rates. The mental health crisis in our country is real, and it is being exacerbated heavily by social media and smartphones. And that's what his book so perfectly identifies. So then it is, now we know that it's a problem. We know that it is a problem that we are allowing to happen. What can we do to help make it better? And you do a great job laying out 4 specific things that help us do a better job and fix this problem. I think for so many of us, parents especially, you feel overwhelmed when you're looking at all of these decisions and when do I give my kid a phone and what do I let it have on it. Most of us use them daily, but how do we put safeguards in place? The process, again, can be so overwhelming that you don't even know where to start. So knowing you're not doing it alone is a big piece of it, and that's one of the things that I think is really important for this group in this room to hear are, one, those easy solutions. I say easy, easy to wrap your mind around, maybe not always easy to implement solutions, but also that you're not doing it alone, that people are actually looking for others to join them in this process. And each one of us have spheres of influence that we can bring to the table so that we're not doing it by ourselves. We're trying to lead from a state perspective, and that's why it was so important for me to send copies of the book to so many members of our legislature, as well as to other governors around the country. This isn't a red state issue or a blue state issue. It's not Democrat or Republican. We're seeing anxiety, depression, suicide, lack of engagement in the classroom. That's impacting everybody. Every single person in this room, whether you know it or not, it is impacting you, your kids, and your community. And we have to do a much better job of raising awareness, talking about it, and nobody has done that better, and I think more succinctly and certainly with a bigger platform and microphone than Dr. Haidt, which was why it was important for us to get that out there and to get him to Arkansas to talk about it.
What kind of reaction did you get specifically from governors around the country?
You know, it's interesting, but I got so much feedback from other governors. Some were already looking at things that they could do in their own states, and some really weren't paying attention to it, and now they are. And so we as governors can work collectively, and there are several Democrat-led states that are taking action. Arkansas has implemented and passed legislation to prohibit access to social media for anyone under the age of 18 without parental permission. We ended in a lawsuit, so it hasn't quite gone into effect, but you know, I feel like in this business, if you're not getting sued about once a week, you're probably not doing anything meaningful, and so that's a joke, feel free to laugh. But we know that we have to take aggressive actions like that. One of the things that we also did that to me was so incredibly telling, and Dr. Haidt's team worked closely with us on it, but we opened up a voluntary program, a grant program. Secretary Jacob Oliva, Department of Education, is here and helped lead that effort across the state. But we told every school in the state, if you're willing to either put pouches or lockers, the state will pay for it. And so we opened up this grant program. Instead of taking a really aggressive, heavy-handed, top-down approach, forcing schools to go phone-free, we opened it up as a voluntary program. And within the first 6 weeks, 75% of school districts across Arkansas opted in. That tells you how hungry and how desperate our schools are to have solutions implemented.
And I was going to get to that. That was actually my next question. That's the pouch program, the pilot program. How is that going? And I know I just heard just a while ago that there's actually research that's being done with it, but have you gotten any kind of feedback so far? And just explain to me also, if you will, Governor, how does this program work? When students come in, they have a cell phone, what happens after that?
So we've left that up to the individual schools, how exactly they implement it. But what we've done is help provide, again, funding so that they can purchase pouches or they can put in lockers in the schools for students to place their phones in. And we partnered with the University of Arkansas to do research and study so that we have proof of concept. So it's not just, oh, we have this great idea, let's see what happens, but let's track the progress and see the success and the impact that it's having in the classroom. We had a couple schools that were ahead of the curve and had already implemented similar programs. Bentonville West High School started this a little over a year ago, and they have already been tracking that data. That was one of the ideas we got from Dr. Haidt. He said, don't just do the program, you have to track it so that you have data so that we can show other schools, other places, how much of an impact it has, so others will follow. Bentonville started that, and they have a year's worth of research. Within the first year, they saw their violent and verbal behavioral issues drop by 51% in 1 year of removing phones from the classroom. They saw drug offenses drop 57% in 1 year. Over 80% of teachers, students, and parents say they overwhelmingly support going phone-free because they're seeing the direct impact that it's having. This is something that has not just a desperate need, but wide support. And I think you can talk about some of the things you've seen in other states as well, where it's having a significant impact.
Yeah, and I'd like to add on to that by saying, look, if this is so good, why didn't schools do it before? And if phones are so bad for kids, why didn't we not give our kids phones? And the reason is because this product class has put us all into a trap, a collective action trap. So how many of you here are parents of a kid under 18? Raise your hand. Okay. How many of you gave your kid a phone earlier than you wanted to because your kid came to you and said, Mom, I'm the only one in the whole school who doesn't have a phone, or something like that? Raise your hand if that was you. Okay, so a lot of us are put in this trap, and a lot of your kids are younger, you will be put in this trap. So this is called a collective action trap. We might all know what the right thing to do is, but if you're the one who doesn't give, like I don't give my daughter Snapchat, and she says she's the only one in her whole high school who doesn't have Snapchat, she's 15, so I'm putting her at a disadvantage. But if someone would set a norm, if someone would say, how about if none of us give our kid a smartphone till high school? That's the first norm. How about if none of us let our kids open accounts on social media until they're 16? Well, now you've got a clear marker, and now you as a parent, you're not the bad guy. You can say, well, this is what everyone is doing, or this is what the school asked us to do, or this is what the governor said. And so that's why what Governor Sanders did is so important, because before you got active on that issue, every school was on their own, every family was on their own, there wasn't coordination. But when you have a clear signal from the top, and not just, hey, I think we should do this, but I think we should do this, and here's money for anyone who wants to try. I just learned today at lunch that this all started in July, that the first meeting of superintendents and the Secretary of Education, that was in July. Well, so what you've done in this state to get organized, to get it implemented, to get 75% of the districts want to participate in that money, it's miraculous. And it's also beautiful to see it's not just coming from the top, it's meeting a demand in the middle and even the bottom. The superintendents love it, the teachers love it, they want it for a long time. Now let me check on the younger people. Raise your hand if in this room, if you were born after 1995. How many Gen Z do we have? Okay, not a lot. There's only about 7 or 8 of you. Okay? How many, so just Gen Z, people, how many of you think that it is a good idea to get phones out of schools? Raise your hand. Okay, that's all of you. How many of you think that it would be a good idea to keep kids off of social media until at least 16? Raise your hand. Okay, and that's all of you again. So here's my point. People think, oh my God, the kids are going to push back. The kids are going to be so upset if we're taking their phones and locking them up. But the kids themselves see. Gen Z understands what's happening. They see what's happening to them, but they feel trapped. They feel that they can't escape. And so when these programs are implemented, this has been thrilling to hear in my 2 days here in Arkansas, when they're implemented, the principals, the heads of school, they all think there's going to be a big student pushback, but there isn't. And within a couple of weeks, the students love it. So it took this decisive action by the governor to send the signal, we're doing this. But we're not going to force you. It's optional, but we think this is important.
Can I jump in really
Absolutely.
fast? Since Jonathan made us all raise our hands and out our age already, I feel like I can easily put you on the spot. But I think if we can back up just a tiny bit, and you touched on it some, but I think it's really important for people to hear in your initial study, in your initial research for the book, I think it's really helpful for people to understand the real damage and the real danger of us not taking these steps. And I think if you can paint a more clear picture of, I mean, we're talking about it in really high level. We know, anxiety and depression and suicide rates are skyrocketing. Will you be a little bit more specific and go into a bit more detail to define some of the big problems that you saw and why it's so important for us to take action?
Certainly. So I'll start with the mental health because that's what this all started with, but there's so much more than the mental health damage. On the mental health front, there's a thing called self-harm, which is not generally a suicide attempt, but it is, girls especially will cut themselves, and it's related to an anxiety disorder, but it's terrifying for the family. You see your daughter cutting herself and bleeding. 10 to 14-year-old girls didn't used to do this. This was really more like a mid-teen to late-teen girl thing until 2012. And then the rate of self-harm among 10 to 14-year-old girls triples, and it's what the older girls had a few years earlier. So our young teen girls are as anxious and depressed and self-harming as older teen girls used to be. The suicide rate is up 50 to 100%, depending on which group you're looking at. So these are horrific things happening. One survey by the CDC found, I forget what the percentage who said they are habitually sad and depressed, but there was a question, have you made a suicide plan? And it was something on the order of 20% of American teenage girls said yes to that at least they'd thought about suicide deeply enough to think, how would I do it? Something has gone terribly, terribly wrong. And this isn't just something you're reading about a story in the newspaper. This is something you know a kid. How many of you think about all the people you know, all your friends, your siblings? Do they have a child who's having these serious anxiety, depression issues? Raise your hand if you know of someone in your circle who's having these serious mental health issues. Okay, so it's very widespread. So it's an enormous cost of human suffering to the kids and to the parents, to the families, to the siblings. But it's what I've learned since I turned in the manuscript for the book a year ago is that it's so much more than mental health. Educational attainment is dropping around the country. We have the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP. It shows slow, steady progress, improving education outcomes across the country from 1971 through 2012. And then it starts going down. Imagine that. All the effort we're putting into improving the education of our kids, and we're going backwards. And it's not just us, it's happening around the world. So if not just America, but humanity is getting less educated, more anxious, more depressed, more suicidal, less creative on some measures, this is a global crisis. And we have to act quickly and decisively because kids need to grow up in the real world, not on a screen.
And I was going to get to that specific number that you talked about in terms of suicide, depression, and all of these things. Do we have Arkansas numbers on that? Because what you're giving us are national numbers, right?
Yeah, that's right. I don't have any Arkansas numbers,
okay.
But what I can say is that this is happening across the country and demographic groups. There are some small differences. There are male-female differences always in these sorts of data. But when you look by race, by social class, the differences are pretty small. Like you'd think like, oh, well, isn't it just like something hitting the rich kids or the poor kids, but it isn't. It's really across the board.
Let me ask this question, and this is really a reporter's point of view, but, and I shouldn't say point of view, but something that a reporter would ask, and I'm a reporter. There are school shootings happening across the nation. There are some parents who feel like they always want to be in contact with their child. They likely would not call that child every day, but if something were to happen, they want to know that they have access. What do you say to parents who say, but I want my kid to have a phone?
Yeah. No, thank you for that, because that is the main objection that we get from parents. What if something terrible happens? What if there's an emergency? And God forbid, what if there's a school shooting? And so here's what I advise school administrators to say. Start by acknowledging the fear. So it's something like, I understand your fear. I'm a parent too, and if there was such a thing at my kid's school, I would want to know that my kid was okay. But we have to do what's best for the kids, not what's best for us. And what all the experts say is that if there is an actual school shooting, you want the kids to be quiet, following directions, doing what they drilled to do. You don't want them all pulling out their phones and crying to their parents and calling for their parents to come to school and clog the roads so that the first responders can't even get there. So we have to do what's best for the kids, not what's best for our feelings. Would that be effective, do you think?
You know what? I just had a visual when you said that. And let's say there is, God forbid, a school shooting, and someone calls their child and the phone rings when they're trying to hide.
That's right, exactly.
And I
I
don't
see.
think
They hear it, like they hear it on the radio or something.
Or the gunman hears the phone ringing and knows that the kids are hiding over here. Right. That's a horrible thing to have to think about, but you make a good point.
That's right.
I'm going to date myself a little bit here, which I should not do as a news anchor, but I grew up in a time when, we didn't have social media, we didn't have video games. If we wanted entertainment, we watched TV or we would go outside and play. I know you talk a lot about kids going outside and playing. I remember when video games came into existence, and the talk was kids need to get rid of the video games and go outside and play. Then social media emerged, and now cell phones and internet, all of these things. But technologically, we keep moving down the road and we don't see what's coming. So how do you battle that? I mean, we're talking about social media, specifically cell phones now, getting the cell phones out of the schools. But when this is done, there's a whole list of other technology that's coming toward us.
That's right. So what we need is a culture change. Just as when I was in high school, it was normal for 14 and 15-year-old kids to smoke cigarettes, and now it's not. Now we think actually, no, that's terrible. They shouldn't be doing that. And in the same way, the idea of a kid just vegetating on a screen where any company is sending them whatever they want, we're going to come to see this as a problem. So here's what I want you to keep your eye on, especially those of you who have sons. The story in the book is actually a tragedy in 2 acts. The first act is we lose the play-based childhood. We stop letting our kids out. We're afraid they'll get kidnapped. So we keep our kids in. This starts really in the 90s. Oh, at the same time, the internet is suddenly everywhere, and families are getting it, and our kids love it, and they're on computers, and that must be good, right? Computers are good, right? So in the 90s is when we transition away from a play-based childhood to a sort of an internal, computer, video game sort of childhood. But mental health doesn't decline just yet. It's really only in 2012 when you're in that period where they get fully on. So my point is this. The boys, it's not that they're getting depressed from social media. It's that the electronic stuff got better and better and better. And originally you didn't have porn on your video games. But now, with high-speed data, once you get around 2010, 2012, there's infinite access to hardcore porn for boys around the clock, and a lot of them watch a lot of it. So as the electronic world, as the video world got better and better and better, it sucks the boys in. They do less well in school. Girls are crushing them at every level, from kindergarten through PhD. Girls are outperforming boys. Boys are dropping out. We look in at the kids at 28. What do we see? The girls more of them have graduated from college. They've gone and gotten jobs. They're not living with their parents. Whereas a lot more of the boys haven't done anything and they're living with their parents. So to get back to your question, as the electronic world gets better and better, it's more of a magnet for our boys, especially. And AI is really beefing that up. With AI, the porn is going to be, God knows what they're going to turn it into. Are you lonely? Have an AI friend. You can make an AI friend already, and they're going to get better and better. So we're going to lose the boys in particular unless we establish the principle that these technologies that are often really powerful and helpful for adults, AI, if you've used ChatGPT, it can do a lot for you. But that doesn't mean it's appropriate for kids. Kids have to learn to do things. They have to struggle. They have to go outside. They have to get into arguments. They have to do things with other kids. And we can't just let them get onto a screen and vegetate there. The results are going to be terrible.
Governor, I'm going to get into LEARNs in just a minute and the literacy component of that. But one of the things that I'm hearing, especially with you, Jonathan, is if we remove the cell phones out of the schools, or such access to them, if you do it for one kid, do it for all the kids, then you don't have children that are saying, but so-and-so has it and I don't. So it's just kind of a blanket approach, if I can use that phrase, to all of the children, and then they're all in it together, and they get conditioned to realizing that they don't need it. As I just mentioned that, I have some other thoughts on that too. I'll get to that in a minute, but I do want to talk about literacy and how this can have an effect on improving literacy scores in Arkansas.
Sure, and one thing I want to comment on is, you said that it's a collective action, and that's a term that you use a lot, and I think that's a really important piece of this. One, it's a lot easier when all of the parents or the entire school is making a decision to go phone free, then your child isn't isolated in that way. And some of the things that we're hearing from teachers, from principals, even from students, we were in a school together yesterday, the kids actually like it. It removes a lot of the pressure from the students as well. They fight it at the beginning, but once they get used to it, they actually enjoy it a lot more. And one of the things that you're hearing repeatedly from schools that are going phone free is kids are actually talking to each other again. If you walk down the hallway of most middle school, junior high, and high schools at this point where they still allow phones, nobody's speaking. It's quiet. None of us grew up in schools where the lunchroom wasn't loud and the hallways weren't always boisterous. Right now, you walk down a hall, no one's talking to each other because they're all looking down. And because of the removal, kids are speaking to each other. They're developing relationships, not only via text, but actual face-to-face communication, which will serve them a lot better in the long run. And so I think there's some, outside of just your overall, decrease in some of the really big stuff of anxiety and depression and suicide rates, classroom engagement, there's also just some of the basic human connection that people are having again because of the removal of the phone. And it's taking so much pressure off of the students while they're at school. In terms of literacy, because I know that was the question you asked, I promise I won't ignore it. Usually Q&A means questions and avoidance, but in this case, I'm actually trying to lean in and answer your questions. Literacy was one of the biggest parts of the LEARNS Act. It's not always the piece that's talked about the most, but I think it's one of the most foundational and most important pieces of the legislation, because we know what a huge benchmark it is for a child. If they can read by the time they hit third grade, we're setting them up for a lifetime of success. If they can't, then we are essentially putting them on a pathway to failure. If you look at, there's some really specific data, not only of just hitting that benchmark, you look at our prison system. In Arkansas, 70% of those who are incarcerated can't read. It is a very telling thing. Unfortunately, in Arkansas, most people are like, oh, everybody can read. They can't. Only 35% of Arkansas third graders are reading at or above a third grade reading level, slightly below the national average. The national average only hits around 40 to 41%. That means more than half of the kids in our country are being set up for failure. So we have to make a huge transformational change, and that's one of the big parts of the LEARNS legislation. We've hired through the state and deployed north of 120 literacy coaches that go into the classroom, meet one-on-one with the students and in smaller groups to help catch them up and bring them up to speed in a way that we've never had that type of hands-on interaction and engagement led by the State Department. Mississippi did this, and it pains me desperately to use Mississippi ever as an example for doing something right and better than Arkansas. But Mississippi continually fought Arkansas for the bottom slot. We were always 48th, 49th, and 50th, right there together, fighting for who was going to be last. In the last several years, because of Mississippi's focus on literacy, they've moved from fighting us at the bottom to right now they're 22nd in the country for childhood literacy and climbing like this. Wow. So we took a lot of the things that were happening there, a lot of the programs that they implemented, we've put them in our state and added to them, and I know that we are going to see a transformational change that will have a lifelong impact, not just on our students, but our entire state. Everything we want to see happen, economic development, better health care, better success stories, ties back to that. So we know we have to do a better job laying that foundation. We've leaned heavily into it, and I think that's going to make a really big difference.
The dynamic of the phone-free school program, let's talk a little bit about that, because it includes mental health support, such as telehealth services, access to behavioral care in school. How do these measures address the mental health challenges that Jonathan talked about?
So one of the things that we learned, we sat down with about 25 superintendents from all over the state of Arkansas in July, which was where our phone-free school grant program was born from. We went into it thinking that we would throw this idea out and see what the reaction was. We did not realize the level of support that we would immediately get, but we were also asked in that same meeting, don't just look for removing phones from the schools, but how can we do a better job with the mental health crisis that's already ongoing? And so that was something that was really important and worked with the team. I see our Surgeon General, Kay Chandler, here, and several other members who played a very active role in addition to the phone-free school part of the grant program. We also created a telehealth coordination program so that schools can have access, because not every school in the state is going to be able to have a behavioral health specialist in their school, in their classroom. There are a lot that do, and that's amazing, and we want to continue that. But there are a lot of schools that don't have that access, one, because that person doesn't even exist in their community, but also they're so full they couldn't possibly take any more cases or time on. So what we've been able to do is connect them to mental health professionals through a telehealth services and coordination program, so that we have, we're expanding that direct access to a lot more students to help catch kids up. And that's one of the things I think that you talk about a lot, are that connectivity and that piece, and making sure you have that access to every student.
Okay. We haven't talked specifically about parental response to this. What have you been hearing from parents?
Most of the feedback we've had, there are some initial pushback, I think, to what we were speaking about earlier. If there is an emergency, if there is a crisis, I need to be able to reach my child. We talked in a school yesterday that had implemented this program, and they said they had to retrain their staff and their front office and their parents to remember, you can still call the school the same way our parents got in touch with us. But they also have to do a better job of being responsive from the front office. If a parent calls, they need an immediate call back. They need to be able to reach someone. And once people get over the initial shock of not being able to talk to their kid every minute, they love it. It's a good thing because they're seeing the positive impact that it has on their kids. It also relieves a lot of the pressure off of the parents. If it's the school, if it's the state, if it's the district that is making this case and saying we're going phone free, then it takes that pressure from the parent having to be the bad guy. It takes that pressure from the teacher having to be the phone police in the classroom. I have a lot of people that get mad at me every day, so what's one more, Thankfully, those students can't vote yet, so it's a good thing for me. Hopefully, they'll see the positive side of it by the time they turn 18. But in all seriousness, it is relieving, frankly, a lot of the pressure off of teachers, off of parents, and even off of kids. And so after that program first gets started, the feedback has been extremely positive, to the point where people are thanking us instead of complaining for implementing the program.
Yeah, I'd like to add on to that about taking pressure off of parents. There's a really stunning statistic I came across in the book. I show a graph of this. If you look at the amount of time that American men and women spent with their kids in the 50s, 60s, 70s, it was relatively low compared to today. And something happened suddenly in the 1990s. The amount of time that women are spending with their kids goes way, way up. Now, what we have going on here is women used to not, for the most part, be in the workforce. They were home, but they weren't spending hours and hours playing with their kids and supervising them, taking them here and there. Get out of here, kids. Go out and play. Don't come back till dinner time. I'm busy. And that was incredibly healthy, because that's where kids grow up, is having those adventures. So what have we done? And back then, there were a lot of kids. A lot of families had 3, 4, 5 kids. Now what's happened is women are working, so they have a lot less time, and they have many fewer children, usually just 1 or 2, and they're spending a lot more time with them. And so, of course, women are overwhelmed. What's the solution? Get out of here, kids. Go out and play. Now, we can't quite do that as easily as we could in the 1960s and 70s. For one thing, the crime rate's a lot lower today than it was back then, and there's many fewer drunk drivers. But despite those benefits, it still is really hard for us to let our kids go outside. So I do think we have to be a bit more deliberate. We have to find ways for our kids to meet up with other kids, because there's just not that many. It used to be you'd go out and there'd be other kids around somewhere. But this is the next challenge for us, is don't keep your focus just on the social media and the phones. Keep it on childhood. We have to give our kids back a childhood worth having and worth remembering. And if you do that, it's a lot less work for the parents than what we're doing now.
How do you start to, once you get buy-in to all of this, how do you transform this into the home environment? Because, kids leave the school, now they've got their cell phones again, and they're back at it. And I also think, just using myself as an example, it seems like I am attached by the hip with this thing. I mean, I brought it out with me. I couldn't even leave the room back there without having this cell phone. Kids are seeing their parents on their cell phones all the time. Parents aren't always paying attention to the kids because they're, online. How do we get our society to just kind of, push this to the side a little bit?
So many of us are feeling kind of overwhelmed. How many of you feel just kind of like fragmented, overwhelmed, there's just too much stuff coming in? Raise your hand if that's the way you feel. So a lot of us feel that way, and most of what we're doing, I assume, is work-related. We're multitasking, we're trying to get a lot of work done. So that's what the adults are doing, and it's not such a terrible thing, except that it's overwhelming for us. What the kids are doing isn't work. What the kids are doing is consuming entertainment content and managing their brand online. These are both things that are blocking out other things they should be doing. So I don't have much to say to adults about, you should be off your phone. When you're interacting with your kid, especially when they're very young, you should be either fully present or fully absent. Don't do what most of us do, is called continuous partial attention. That's very disturbing for the kids. It's unsatisfying for us. We spend hours doing it because we're busy. And yes, the ducky, yes. We're looking back and forth. That kind of freaks the kid out because they learn their internal working model of a parent is someone who sometimes looks at me but sometimes doesn't. And so we do have to be very careful, especially with younger kids. But I think kids are not really copying us. If you adopt great phone habits, your kid isn't going to say, oh, I was going to check what everybody said about my last Instagram post, but I'm going to be like mama. No, they're not. Teenagers are not copying us. They are totally focused on what other teens are doing.
Okay. We are going to open this up to audience participation. I know you guys probably have questions. You've been a great audience, by the way. Wouldn't you agree? We have a great panel, and we have a great audience as well. If you remember, when you registered for this, we gave you an opportunity to ask a question, and I do have some of those right now as we set up our microphones. We have microphones on both sides, so if you have a question, just come right down to the microphone and fire away. One of the questions, though, that I have from the audience for you guys, how can we get the attention of Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat to understand the dangers of social media on the young mind and to avoid targeting them to increase screen time at such a young age?
Lawsuits and litigation.
Oh,
Next
my.
question. That's really it, because we know, and now that there are lawsuits filed by attorneys general of 35 states against these companies, filed by thousands of parents whose kids are dead or disfigured, now that these lawsuits are going on, we're getting documents out from an internal email and memos and presentations. They know what they're doing. They are under orders, their employees are under orders to maximize engagement. They are trying to addict our kids. The people who make the technology, they don't let their kids have it. They send their kids to the Waldorf school, a lot of them, where there's no technology. They don't want their kids to have it, they want our kids to have it. And so it's clear that we can't appeal to their conscience. It's clear that we can't persuade them. The amount of money at stake is so vast that the only way to compel them to start giving a damn is to sue them and legislate against them. And there are some obstacles in America. We're having some trouble getting things through the court system, but other countries are acting now. You may have heard Australia just raised the age. A year from now, you're going to have to be 16 to open an account, and the platforms have to do something to verify age. So the world is moving. We all hate this, and I'm very optimistic that things are going to change.
Go ahead.
I do think we have gotten their attention. I think we've seen a shift already that they're paying attention in a way that they never have before, in large part because you're seeing states file legislation, you're seeing countries enact measures to prevent kids from being online or having access to social media in as big of measures as they have. I think things like your book being on the, top bestsellers for 25, 30 weeks, something, 35, but we're not counting. 34 and a half in 3 hours. But aside from that, people are paying attention now in a way that they haven't because they're being forced to. And I think that the more that we take action collectively, the harder it will be to ignore. And I think they will be more willing to work with us to implement some of those provisions and some of those protections for kids. You're already starting to see a lot of the big tech companies look for ways that they create teen accounts that do require parental permission and things like that. And I think there's going to be a greater movement in that direction.
Another question from the audience. How can parents who delay the smartphone for their children feel supported and help their children feel less alone and left out? I know you've already touched on some of that, but
Sure.
could you expand?
The key is to make sure that they're not alone. So it is very hard to say, all of your friends have this and you're not going to. But it's much easier to say, some of your friends have this, but some of you don't. Because I've been talking with the parents of, Billy and Bobby or whoever, and we all agree. We're all going to do this thing that the governor is recommending, or that the school is recommending, or that the Surgeon General is recommending. We're all going to do this thing where we're going to just give you a flip phone or a phone watch when you're in middle school. We want to be able to text you when you're out, so you can have that, but you're not going to get a smartphone until you're in high school. So what kids are terrified of is not having a smartphone, it's being the only one who doesn't have it. And so the more you reach out to just your circle of friends who, you all picked your kids up from birthday parties, you probably have each other's text numbers, reach out to your kids' friends' parents, or do something at the school. And the more the principal or the superintendent can put out the word. And this is something interesting that schools are now doing. Schools have always been pretty comfortable saying what the policy is in school, but they've always been very uncomfortable telling parents what to do at home. But that's changing, where schools are now much more willing to you can't order them what to do, but you can suggest. You can say, we're working on this addiction problem, and we ask that you consider not giving your child a smartphone till 14 and not giving your child social media till 16. Just if you would just say that gives parents cover, and then your kid isn't going to be the only one. Even if half of the kids have it, that's not so painful. They just don't want to be the only one.
If I could say, only because I see a lot of my kids' friends' parents in the audience, if you could not cite the governor, feel free to cite Jacob or anybody else. That would be really helpful in my own home as you're making those recommendations. Feel free to blame. Jacob is happy to do that, so he'll take it. Kidding.
I believe we have a question. Could you give us your name and tell us who you are and let us hear your question?
Sure. Can you hear me?
We hear you.
My name's Grace Hartman. I'm a therapist here in Little Rock, work in the mental health field. I'm also a parent. My question's specific to LRSD because I'm curious. I know the LRSD was in the 25%, I guess, that did not opt in to this grant program. I'm curious if you know why, and I'm curious too, I know I've heard you say a couple of different things about it's a district-wide policy, but then I've heard do school officials have the opportunity to do this? Because I have a 5th grader, so we're looking at middle schools, and in several of the meetings I've asked, because I just finished your book 3 weeks ago, and I've asked, is this something that the principals have any say over in their own schools? And they both said no. This is a district, this has to be decided by the district. I know the school district is asking parents their opinion, and a lot of what you've said obviously has come up. And so I'm just curious, what are the options there for LRSD? Why did they not opt in, and what are the options for parents who would love to see that happen?
Well, I can't answer specifically of why they chose not to participate, but I do expect that as more and more districts see the success in other districts and other schools, that they will follow suit. But in terms of individual schools, there's no reason that they can't participate. There's no reason that a principal can't take and move his school or hers to be phone free. And so I think that as a parent, lean into that. Ask your principals, individual teachers can make their classroom phone free if they want to. Now, it's a lot better and a lot more productive if the entire school does so, but I encourage as parents, get other parents to ask your school, ask your principal to go phone free, because again, it helps provide that cover. But there's no school that doesn't have the ability to participate. Certainly we have leaned in and focused on a district specific component for the grant program, just because it's easier to reach more students in that way and to disseminate funds and things like that, just from a purely logistic standpoint. But there's no reason an individual middle school, junior high, or high school can't participate.
Thank you.
Great question, thank you. I think we have another question here.
Thank you, Dr. Sanders and Dr. Haidt. We appreciate you having the courage and the intentionality to move forward with this project. And so I'm superintendent of schools at Conway. We've got 4 middle schools participating in the pilot project, so around 2,200 kids. And we were moving along just great until my 6th grade son got in the car one day and said, "Dad, what are you doing banning cell phones?" And I said, "That was Governor Sanders' idea." So credit in my...
We're really sad that Conway's funding has just been...
There we go. My question was, we're thrilled to see this roll out, and I've been in the buildings that are participating, and the culture data is amazing. We're about a month into the program, and so it's too early to see what the real data will show us. But we've heard from all 4 middle school principals that this is very positive, the kids are engaged, the discipline is better, so we expect really good outcomes. My question was, where do you see this going long term? We love the partnership from the state. We appreciate the grant funds that we're giving out. And so where do you see this playing out over the next 3 to 5 years, or 2 to 4 years if you can?
I'm hopeful that every school in the state will voluntarily start to implement their own programs. I think it's much better when it happens in that form and organically. I do think, though, that as a leader where we're seeing the level of impact that this is having, if we have to look at something that pushes for legislation to move in that direction, I think ultimately we may go there. But, you know, if you think about it, and you mentioned smoking before, if you go back, you know, several years ago, every single person in this room, many people would be smoking, and you'd have ashtrays on the tables where we sit instead of water. It took a shift in the mindset of the culture before they ultimately banned smoking in restaurants and other places. So we're hopeful that we see that cultural shift and that demand from people and from schools to move in that direction before you have to codify it in legislation. I don't think that's something we take off the table. I think we have to continue to look at ways we encourage, ways we implement, and help protect kids. And so if that is legislation, we certainly have to have that conversation. There are a number of legislators that are here in the room. I encourage you to talk with them, get their feedback and their feeling and their appetite for moving in that direction as well. But I think it's really important for people like you who are seeing the results and the impact that it's having to talk about it with those members and with other parents and even the students, even your son. And if you really need to blame it on me, I'll since he doesn't go to school with my kids, it's fine.
Go ahead, John.
Okay, so I'd like to add on to that. You know, the governor's absolutely right that this has to be a culture shift. And as she said yesterday, you can't just have laws that are getting away from the culture. You can't just say, here's the law, even if it doesn't match the cultures. We have to move together to, what I say in the book is we need to roll back the phone-based childhood and restore the play-based childhood. So this is a change about what we're thinking about childhood. And that matters what we do at home, and it matters what we do in school. So I would say to your question, what's next? What's the long term? Phone-free schools is moving so fast, and the results are so amazingly good that I think all around the country, next September, we're going to see most schools phone-free. This is, I think, going to take care of itself. But what's next? What I'm learning more and more is that when kids come into school without their phones, they still have a screen on their desk because we all went in for these one-to-one policies. We thought somehow it was important for every child to have their own computer on their desk to compete with the teacher. And so I think educational technology is the next frontier. And in terms of creating a culture change, so my team, we're starting a movement. We're trying to guide a movement. If you go to anxiousgeneration.com, we have a lot of resources for educators and for parents. We also have a Substack, afterbabel.com, B-A-B-E-L, afterbabel.com. I mention it because we have 2 pieces in the last 2 months on educational technology. I'm not an expert in it. I didn't have time to do the research for the book, but these 2 experts both say that the distraction effects of giving a kid an iPad or a Chromebook vastly outweigh whatever educational benefits there could be. So I would urge you to look especially at your elementary schools. Do everything you can, especially for kindergarten, first, second grade, do everything you can to get the screens out of their lives entirely. They need to play with each other and with physical things. That, I think, is the next frontier.
Thank you guys for leading the charge, and thank you for doing this today.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I see one other person coming down. We have another question here.
Well, so I walked all the way down here, and then you kind of started to talk about my question, so that's great. But now I'm stuck down here. So I am an elementary school principal. I'm in a district that adopted the cell phone pouches and have had incredible results within our district. And of course, that is for buildings that are not mine, because at an elementary school, if they bring their phone, it's usually in their backpack to like show off on the bus. So far. Fingers crossed. But we do have lots of educational technology that has rolled in, especially post-COVID. So I was an administrator both before and obviously since COVID, and the amount of advertising for buildings to purchase those materials for loss of learning or whatever you'll call it, I mean, it's just outrageous, and that has continued now for years. And so in my building, we did an initiative for unplugging, building-wide. And I hope, we spoke about that at the state level, and I hope that more schools will adopt that. But even for me as a building-level administrator, there's a lot of pressure if other buildings are using online platforms for literacy and math. Mm-hmm. And of course, for teachers, especially our very new teachers, there's a temptation to lean heavily on that. And so it's been a fight, not fighting my staff, but fighting that culture piece. And I guess my question is, in the state of Arkansas, has there been some conversation about eventually legislating screen time for young students? So K-5, where are we at with that? Or is there just a conversation about that?
Certainly there's a conversation. We were actually in a school yesterday and visited a couple of different classrooms, 5th and 6th graders, and the school themselves had adopted a limitation on screen time, and they were in their first year of this program, and I think it was 60 minutes for K through 3, an hour and 20 minutes, and I'm kind of making these up, but guesstimating as they got older, they got a little bit more screen time. I'm not somebody who thinks all technology is bad. I think there's some great uses for technology. I don't think we can replace our teachers with computers, and I think that's a really dangerous road to go down. There are classrooms I've been into across our state where the kids never look up. We walk in, the teacher barely acknowledges we've entered the classroom, and they're all looking at their computers. If that's what they're doing when the Secretary of Education, members of the legislature, and the governor step into the classroom, imagine what every day looks like. And so we have to do a better job of being totally reliant only on technology. While I do think it can be a useful tool to tailor some specific needs for kids and help track some of the progress, we can't use it as a replacement. But one of the things that I thought was so telling about this classroom that we went into is the kids themselves were telling us, we used to spend all day on a computer, and now we don't, and we really like it. We've learned all these different things. Now, this school had a very different program, and they do a lot of out-of-the-classroom learning, a lot of field trip-based learning. They went to a water treatment facility plant, and the kids thought it was amazing. I was like, I've been to a lot of water treatment plants, and I think they're not that fun to look at. But these kids were telling us all about water quality and these different things, and the level of engagement that this student group had was unlike anything I've seen in most classrooms in our state. And it was because they had taken the technology out and put engagement and teacher interaction back in at a heavier level, a lot more hands-on. And so I think that's something certainly that we need to look at, have a conversation about. I don't know that we're at a place where we again, have a top-down, heavy-handed approach, but I do think it's a conversation worth having and one that we should be encouraging more and more schools to take on themselves.
I appreciate that. I would just add, the mental health aspect in elementary schools. We're talking all the time about how we're seeing, like those, the extreme behaviors in elementary schools that we did not see on the level that we do now. And of course, we attribute it to screen time a lot, and even my teachers will talk about how much screen time they're getting at home, and we're kind of ignoring how much screen time they're getting at school where the behaviors are occurring every day. And so anyway, I appreciate your focus on screen time in general, just within this state, and I would love to see that. I know the heavy hand is hard, and we need a lot of research. I think schools out there in Arkansas right now probably have the data to support how it's hurt our kids since COVID, for sure. So thank you very much.
Definitely loving the audience questions. Olivia, we have time for 2 more? Okay, this side.
Good. Yeah. Oh, now we are. Yep. First of all, just thank you, honestly, from us as parents who your book came at us the right time. And we're so grateful for all the work that you've done and the research and what it taught us. Also, thank you for my 11-year-old son who, after reading your book, turned loose this summer. He had the best summer of his entire life.
Wow, fantastic. Yeah.
But having a 5th grade child, so I have a 5th grader. I'm here with a lot of friends and parents who have middle school kids who are very social, and they want to connect with their friends, and they want to make plans, and they don't have home phones anymore. Frankly, a lot of us don't have a home phone, right? And so my question is about the watch versus the phone.
Yep.
And do you see the smart watch as a potential bridge for some of these kids who are probably ready to have some independent communication and engagement with their peers, but we don't necessarily want them having a mini computer
Exactly.
right on their head?
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. The millennials had a flip phone. They could call and they could text. If you're communicating with your friends one-on-one, that's a good thing. Whether it's a phone call or a Zoom call or texting, that's a good thing. When you start getting into group texts and you're performing and 30 people are on the text chain, that's not a good thing. People seem to think if you give your kid a phone, it has to be a smartphone. That's just not true. The norm we need is you just don't get a smartphone before high school. But below that, there's all kinds of options. So I would suggest, I'm not sure about this, it depends on feedback from parents, but I think a lot of parents I hear are having good luck with the phone watch. The key is that it's not an entertainment center. It just is a communication device. Give your kid a communication device. With my son, we gave him the old smartphone, as everybody else did, because we didn't know any better. But my daughter, 3 years later, I got her a Gab watch. It was a big pink watch. All it could do was call 3 numbers. That was it. And it was great. She loved it at first. She was ashamed of it by the time she got to middle school. But she loved it at first. And it was all we needed to send her out into the park to play with a friend. So it was great. And then there's a whole bunch of things. There are some things that look like smartphones, but have very limited functionality. I think those would be okay in middle school. But I would hope we'd have the norm of the simplest, minimalist thing for communication in elementary and middle school. And then, many of you will want to wait even longer than high school, perhaps. But the world is kind of set up to demand that your child have a smartphone. So that's why I sort of said, let's make high school, let's get this out of middle school as much as we can. But yes, go ahead with a phone, watch it, and then let your kid out.
Very good. We have one more question, and then we're going to start to wrap up.
Thank you guys so much. I'm an assistant principal at Little Rock Christian for the high school, and so I'm just wondering, one of my favorite things that you said was we need to give kids back their childhood. And so we've talked so much about anxiety in children, and one thing I feel like I see a lot is anxiety in parents. And so when you said that, the first thing I thought was, how do we give children back their childhood? But maybe more than that, how do we let parents give kids back their childhood?
So speaking as a psychologist, I can say that the cure for anxiety is usually exposure. And I'm going to give you a way to give yourself exposure. This is the most powerful, simple thing you can do. You could do it at home or you could do it in school. It's called the Let Grow experience. So there's a woman named Lenore Skenazy who wrote a book called Free Range Kids because she let her 10-year-old ride the subway in New York City 10, 15 years ago, and when word got out that she'd done this, she was called America's worst mom. How could you do this? But she persevered, and she saw what was wrong with our culture, and together we created an organization called Let Grow. Go to letgrow.org. And our best product, everything's free, but our best production, the thing we've done, which is so powerful, it's so simple. Let's imagine that a third grade class does it. I think third, fourth grade is when kids should be given some independence to walk around and ride bicycles. So suppose everybody in your third grade class, the kids, they take this piece of paper home, and the piece of paper says, here's the assignment, talk with your parents, pick something that you think you can do by yourself, with your parents' permission, but without your parents. And we have some suggestions. Can you go to, is there a store within walking distance? You could go pick up a quart of milk. Do you have a dog? Have you ever walked the dog by yourself? Can you make breakfast for yourself? Can you make breakfast for your family? So it's some suggestions. And the kid does it, and then they come into school and they put what they did, they write it and they put it as a leaf on their little tree. And you do this, let's say, once a month for the whole school year, and they have all these independent activities. And the key thing is having the kid do something away from you. That's the most powerful. So especially if there's a place your kid can walk, maybe it's just to a neighbor's house. You can even pretend. Can you go to Mrs. Smith 4 houses down, ask her for a cup of sugar, and tell Mrs. Smith that you're going to send your kid. You don't need the sugar, but I want him to have, just have them do something. And then what you'll find is that the first time you let your kid out of your sight where no adult is supervising, your heart is in your throat, you're afraid, what if he's hit by a car, a meteorite, a kidnapper? But what happens? The kid goes, gets the quart of the cup of sugar, comes back, and he's really proud of himself. And then you do more and more. And the amazing thing that happens is that the kids get less anxious. We have evidence about this. It's a very powerful cure for anxiety, better than Prozac. No side effects, no harmful side effects. But the most amazing thing is the effect it has on the parents, because we're all so anxious about letting our kid out of our sight. And the first time you do it, it's hard, and the second time it's less hard, and by the fourth time you do it, it's not hard at all. So yes, parental anxiety is a big obstacle to human development. We've got to back off, and the way to do it is by gradually giving our kids independence and then seeing the results, which are almost always magnificent. So again, letgrow.org. You can do it yourself and your family, but it's especially powerful if you do it the whole school, because then what happens? You have a whole bunch of 8 and 9-year-olds walking to the store and playing outside and going to help a neighbor. And before you know it, it's normal for 8 and 9-year-olds to be outside. Nobody will call the police again because, right now nobody has seen that since 1991. But we can make it real again. I would say we have to make it real again, because look what we're facing if we don't.
Jonathan said yesterday when we were in a discussion, let them walk a few blocks to the store. I said, that's a reminder that he lives in New York. And I said, our stores might be 10 or 5, a little bit further away. So a 10-mile hike for an 8-year-old could be a little bit bigger lift.
That's why I made up the Mrs. Smith thing.
They can walk a few blocks to the park. Thank you all for your questions and comments. We really do appreciate that. We're going to wrap up, and are there any final thoughts that you have that you want to share?
I want to once again thank Dr. Haidt for taking the time to travel to Arkansas to help us spread this message. And for him, I can tell certainly while selling books is a great thing, this is a passion and something that you really believe in and are so committed to, not just bringing about change in one community, but truly a global cultural shift. And I think that's what it's going to take. It's going to take a huge movement of people working together, and that's why it's really encouraging to see people that are parents, that are teachers, that are principals, superintendents, business leaders, all made up in this room so that they can go back to their sphere of influence and help us move our culture away from a phone-based childhood. One of the things that to me was a really great line that the CEO for Yonder, which is the pouches that we have in a lot of schools across the state, said, we're not taking anything away, but we're actually giving kids a phone-free education. And I think that's a really important way to look at it. I think so much of what we're talking about is so depressing, so overwhelming, and so negative that if we can turn it and look at it from a positive perspective, we're not taking something away from our kids. We're actually giving them a life back. We're giving them their childhood back. And when we look at it from that perspective and we do it with our friends and our peers, it makes it a lot easier for each one of us. And so instead of only focusing on the negative side of it, I think when we can look at it from the positive, it makes it that much easier to take that next step. And thank you to each one of you for spending your afternoon. I know so many of you have huge demands on your schedule, and I don't even think anybody looked at their phone much of the, you'd feel guilty if you did, but we really appreciate you being here with us and taking time to hear this message, and hopefully take it from here and spread it to other people.
That was so beautiful. That was so powerfully put about giving our kids the childhood back. So I'll add on to that. My closing thought is this. Before the book came out, when I would speak at schools, and then in the first couple months after the book came out, I would say, the main opposition I'm getting is resignation, is parents and people who just say, well, what are you going to do? The genie's out of the bottle. You know, this is the way things are. We can't change it. But I don't say that anymore, because here we are 9 months later, and what I'm seeing is things like this. What I'm seeing is that schools are discovering we can act. We can rid ourselves of these things. Parents are discovering it. Governors are stepping up. And so I've been just wildly optimistic that we are actually going to solve this problem over the next couple of years. And what I've seen yesterday and today here in Arkansas gives me even more hope. What you're doing in the state is amazing. It's top to bottom. It's moving quickly, but with feedback. And so I'm even more encouraged now than I was a couple days ago. We're going to solve this problem. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you for being here. I want to thank you, Governor and Jonathan. Thank you for the time. This has been very eye-opening, very informative, and we will be interested in seeing the outcome of all of this. Thank you, audience, for being here. Enjoy.